Okay, so just to explain, so I'm a doctor by training, and I was lucky enough to be the physician editor of TEDMed last year, and I put the themes together for TEDMed this year. TEDMed is the health version of TED. It's held in DC. This year it was simulcast between DC and San Francisco. It also goes live streaming as well. And it's a really difficult challenge. So you get about 1,800 nominations for the stage. A lot of it is total hyperbole. It's just people who want to have a TED talk. And it takes a lot of sifting, and you put about 40 up there. So you're rejecting about 98 to 99% of the so-called big ideas that are coming in. And when Stephen asked me to talk today, I was just sort of thinking about what are the sort of big trends that I felt from TEDMed last year, but also I've just come back about a month ago from TED this year to try to think about what's really happening in healthcare and what does that mean for the people who process and make use of the data that we collect. So there are really sort of some big trends going on in consumer behavior in general, which is that in general everything is much more personalized. The obvious example is banking, and it gets used everywhere, but we might as well just go there. You know, there's internet. You can do more on the internet. You can do more on your mobile. We're all using services in way more personal ways than ever before. But I sort of don't really like that example, because for me, I think that my favorite example is Sky Plus. I got Sky Plus, thinking about it, started in 2002. How many people have got Sky Plus here? Keep your hands up if you put them up high. How many people who've got Sky Plus watch real-time TV anymore? If you still watch real-time TV. So most of the hands went down. And that's my experience of having Sky Plus, is that now that I've got Sky Plus, I very rarely watch real-time TV. I massively curate my own TV experience. And that's been going on since 2002. In 2006, it went HD. But it's really, in general, it's radically changed how I consume the massive information that's available to me. And now there are sort of more visceral examples. So how many people have Ubered a taxi? So Uber is an app that enables you to quickly order a taxi where you are. It really radically personalizes the taxi experience. You can just say, be outside when I want you to be there, text me when you get there. And there's lots of antibodies to Uber because people talk about how it strips out middle-class jobs. But the truth of it is digital technologies are making it much easier to personalize our own experience of consumer behaviors. Anyone got a home monitor, energy home monitor? Have you found yourself, Stephen's like, oh, my hand's gone up again. It's okay to be a nerd, Stephen. It's okay. I think we're all nerds in here, so we're all good. I haven't got an energy home monitor at home, but I live in a Georgian house built in 1820. I really need a home monitor because, I mean, these things just suck out energy. And so that's probably going to change how I consume energy in my house. So everywhere we look, we're massively personalizing our experiences of things that used to be relatively generic. We used to have top-down stuff, and now we're curating it as we go. And I sort of call this getting personal. And when you apply that to healthcare, there's a sort of a growing voice of the healthcare consumer. Now, one of my favorite talks from 2013 was from a lady called Sally Oken. Now, Sally's not as scary as that looks. Sally's actually very, very awesome. Sally's at an organization called Patients Like Me. Put your hands up if you've heard of Patients Like Me. It's sort of getting a fair amount of traction over here. So just so it really gets people it starts with relatively rare conditions, and people talk about their conditions, and the idea is that by aggregating that data, we'll try to find new targets for intervention. That's really what Patients Like Me is. And Sally is a nurse who's there, but she's also, she now works more on the advocacy side of it. But her actual talk was, when they interviewed more and more patients, they had them broken down by disease stratification. But when you actually interview people, you find way more nuance in a single stratification. People's experience of their illness is not what sits in an ICD-10 code. It's way more nuanced, and that means that the interventions that are possible become more nuanced as well. And Patients Like Me is trying to do that. But what Sally talked about was if what we're trying to do is treat people and give people the care that they want, if we use ICD-10 as the way in which we categorize whether or not they get care, how tailored can we be? How consumer-driven can we be? And that's one of the things that they're asking themselves at Patients Like Me. She talked about there being a patient lexicon. So you actually treat according to the patient lexicon as opposed to what you might see on a pathophysiology slide. And that's quite a big thought because it actually radically changes the delivery of care, the same way in which Uber has done for taxis, Sky Plus has done for the consumption of TV. Are we close to that? Well, probably not yet, but we're starting. So this is a screenshot of the back end of something called My Clinical Outcomes. And My Clinical Outcomes essentially takes PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures, and says how are people scoring on these things. So this is for someone who's had a knee replacement. There's the validated score, the Oxford Knee Assessment Score. You can see there on the chart there, this thing has got there we go. So that's when they have their op. So they're pretty grotty before their op, and then they get better, and then they allegedly do well. And that's fine. It's great. Looks good. So by measuring what patients report as an outcome, we can see whether or not this operation worked. But actually, the nice thing here is that what we might be able to do if you get more and more data is you might actually start being able to work out if that starts tailing off, is there a pattern? Is there a pattern to the tail off? Is it a specific socioeconomic group? Is it people with specific genetic predispositions, et cetera, et cetera? And so by collecting this data, we're beginning to see this. But this, for the time being, is based on patient-reported outcome measures, and they're relatively generic. They're really kind of like genericized lists of what people think patients care about. They're not actually what patients care about. It's really what has been aggregated. And in a way, although this is a good start, it's already being sort of turned into a big industry in the form of ITROM, whose acronym I can never remember. So International Consortium for Health Outcome Measurement. These guys came out of Harvard, and what they're trying to do is they get clever people in the room and say, what outcomes are you looking for when you do some kind of operation? And then they want to track them. And of course, the beauty is that if they can if it's an international consortium and we have even more data, we can really start working out whether our interventions are working or not. At the moment, they're doing, so they've only just started, they've got stuff on prostate cancer, coronary heart disease, low back pain, cataracts, and Parkinson's disease. So I guess if we were to do that scoring for all of those conditions, we might start learning something kind of interesting about whether we're actually doing any good for patients. Again, it's making healthcare more personalized. What I love about this screenshot, by the way, is that he looks really, I'm guessing this is like, he's got low back pain, but he's really, it's all good. He can carry his little and all that kind of stuff. But I sort of feel like she looks a bit worried, doesn't she? She's a bit like, just take me off Grandpa. He's going to go any minute now. Measuring the result that matter. Can I carry the little one without dropping her? So this, for me, PROMs is a start. Patient-reported outcome measures. They're a start towards what Sally talked about, this dream of patients defining what they actually want. But they're still generic tools. A PROM is still a very generic tool. And some people are actually taking it a bit further. So this splodge is it's data from 30,000 volunteers at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York with diabetes who are having certain interventions. And each splodge is an intervention, and where it gets brighter into orange is where there seems to be clustering of certain interventions. And what you can see here is diabetes, obviously classically type 1, type 2. So we allegedly think there are two types of diabetes, and that's what we derive from a pathophysiology slide. But if we actually look at how people are experiencing their healthcare, there appear to be one clear splodge here, one splodge there. This is technical talk, by the way. Do let me know if splodge isn't translating for you. A splodge over here and a potential splodge over here. And what these researchers are beginning to show is that actually when it comes to what people need, as opposed to what it shows on a slide, on a pathophysiology slide, what people need aggregates differently. And that actually could potentially change how we treat patients. Now, there's a whole bunch of confounding variables in this data. First of all, these are volunteers, so we don't really know the bias in this data set. And secondly, this is still clinical intervention. This is not based on what people want. This is not people curating their own TV. This is people who've needed stuff doing to them. You could take that a bit further and say, what did people actually want? And that takes this to a whole nother level. And it's actually quite complicated. But there is one company in England at last. Usually it's always an American company that leads this way. But outcomes-based healthcare is doing some really interesting work. It's very experimental, where they try to get people in the room and they try to understand what do people actually want. And from that, they then try to work out how do you shape care. Not what interventions do we have, but what do they want. So essentially going back to this kind of thing and sort of saying, did this lot want this? What do they actually want? What do they want there? And where all this thinking is going is there are probably 4 types of diabetes based on what people actually want / need. 4 types of diabetes, and we only really have 2. So as soon as you have that, you actually have a fundamental shift of your approach to care. And this is the stuff that is going on out there, and people are making this real. So I don't think we've actually really begun to understand this very fundamental shift that we're actually at the beginning of, but that is really what's going on. Now, everywhere I go, and certainly when we put the program together at TED, I feel like shooting my brains out when I hear the words big data. So sort of, I sort of feel like it was probably always big. Certainly to this group, you probably always wanted it to be big before you tried to make a recommendation in one way or another, right? I mean, you were always striving for some level of bigness. This is my level of understanding of statistics. You were striving for some level of bigness in order to be able to actually advise as to whether to continue with a drug or with a trial or whatever. So I do find that there's a sort of a hyperbole around data that I find very problematic. And in fact, I find it almost a religion right now. Everywhere you go, everyone goes, if we make the data big, build a database big enough, we'll get an answer. Well, you all know that that's probably not the case, right? But it is literally a religion. And this is my favorite example, and this is not a Photoshop picture. This is Barcelona's supercomputing data hub, and they needed to find somewhere to house this massive supercomputer and all the data storage, and what they found was a disused church. That was my favorite picture about big data, so I tend to trot that out everywhere. Okay, great, fine. It's a religion, it's out there. I'm probably speaking to the converted about how much hyperbole is in this space. But I sort of asked myself, honestly, that's not, I can see people laughing, that's not Photoshop, that's a real image of, I guess they've enhanced the colors in that. This is stuff you guys know, right? So there's data, and then there's, when we put it into context, there's information, and then when you want to know something about it, it's knowledge, and then after that, there may be wisdom. Now, for me, when you're down here, sure, we might aggregate more and more data, but we did the Human Genome Project. We basically worked out what all those GTs, A's, and C's were in terms of what was there. That was great. And then about 2002, 2003, we started ENCODE. So ENCODE was about saying, well, which bits of the DNA sequence seems to be useful for something. And at the very beginning of that, there was a very unhelpful shorthand for the stuff that looked like it was just there to link bits of functional DNA. And it was called junk DNA. And, well, it was actually originally called link DNA, and then people started calling it junk DNA. And then the people who were actually doing the work said, well, actually, no, this so-called junk is really useful because it upregulates and downregulates the bits of the stuff that we think is functional DNA. So before we knew it, we thought what we were doing was actually getting close to the data that mattered when we went from the Human Genome Project to the ENCODE project. But actually what's happened is the more that we've learned about the data in the human genome, the harder we found that we can get to any kind of knowledge. We thought that we would look, we would see it, there's the genes, there's the mutations, let's go in there. We can now create treatments. That's what we thought we were going to do when we started ENCODE. A decade later, what we're actually realizing is that it's way more complicated than we thought when we started. In fact, it's not complicated, it's complex. I'm not going to get into the nuances of that. I'm sure you guys all know the difference. And so actually getting to actionable insights, things that you can actually do, is getting harder and harder and harder. And that's one of the things that I find most problematic about the hyperbole of big data, because it isn't going to just lead to answers. Now, that said, there are people out there who are doing great jobs at getting and trying to get lots of different streams of data and create actionable knowledge. You'll probably all know that electronic health records are all completely structured differently, to the point at which they're hardly any use to anyone when it comes to any form of analysis. Well, one company in Boston is doing a really good job. So I don't know if you guys know Smart, but Smart is doing a really good job of essentially sticking an API on it, creating a taxonomy or a vocabulary that works across different streams and enables us to try to work out what's going on. And it started off as a little experimental project, and what it's done now is it's gone as far as being able to actually send information to the FDA about late side effects to drugs that had already been licensed. And so this is actually really nice, real-world data collection, finding actionable insights and doing something with it. And that's, for me, I think is a really important step in where our use of data is. It's more real. It's not just about masses of it. It's actually saying, how do we mine this to find a useful insight? But I also sort of can't help feeling that if we go back to the challenge here for data and getting big was really a challenge of storage. So ENCODE as a project had been trying to work out what the human genome was really about, was limited by our ability to store data. And once we actually got better and better at that, that's where we thought we'd have the analysis, and actually that's when we realized we weren't going to get as many actionable insights as if we thought we were going to get. But our ability to store data is we're getting a lot better. I mean, you can get the tiniest chips with the biggest storage these days. It's kind of exciting what's going on. But I sort of think that this battle is over. I know that the management consultancies out there are going to want you to spend lots of money on big data solutions. But I sort of feel like this is over. This is just really the market just has to just get out there and roll out all these kind of big solutions to store data. And I think really the challenge is going to be in this. It's amazing sneezing. Well, thanks a lot. The challenge is going to be to try to get to knowledge. And I think that there's one company that I think is really interesting right now, and I haven't quite worked out their business model yet. But they're called, there was a wonderful article about them called a dating site for algorithms. And really all it is you can go, I've got an algorithm, have you got data that we can throw at it? Or the other way around, I've got data, can you throw an algorithm at it? It's kind of phishing in the sort of worst way possible. It's a sort of rubbish, it sounds really rubbish. But it's actually very interesting because it's an open source platform and people being able to actually critique other people's algorithms. And it seems to me that actually if data storage, if I'm right, and there's no reason why that necessarily that I am, but if data storage is not really the battleground for tomorrow, if we've got data storage down, tomorrow's battleground is going to be really on the algorithms. So the question becomes is who's policing the algorithms? I mean, no one's probably asked that question yet, right? I mean, it's probably happening in your individual institutions. But who's really policing these algorithms that are out there? I quite like Algorithmia just for making it open, for having the an open source platform for it. The other bit that I just asked myself is this the future of NICE? So right now, NICE does its own analysis and then comes out with clinical guidance. But I actually just wonder is the future of someone like NICE, if data is all deposited in big data sets and lots of people are throwing algorithms at it in this kind of matchmaking style, is the role of NICE to really say which algorithms are the ones that they want to use? Or how would they nuance a certain algorithm in order to come up with the knowledge? That may be where things are going, because I think just really saying the idea that we do clinical trials and then we come up with knowledge and then we apply them in practice probably doesn't make a huge amount of sense when you're trying to understand phenomena like this and how people actually want to experience their conditions. So, I'm skipping around. So, what's the response that's going on out there? I was thinking about drugs and devices. And I thought the last thing I'm going to do is come here and talk to this crowd about the pharmaceutical industry. So I sort of dodged the therapy side of things. But if we actually look at something like access to drugs, I was actually trying to get my head around how I might come at this from a drugs perspective. This is a great example. I've just realized that people are probably just going to start reading it. I could probably just go quiet and you could just read the slide. It makes life easier. I tell you what I really like about this is it's a great example where we have a top-down approach to doing something, in this case, selling drugs according to the GDP of a country and pricing on that basis. So there's a sort of a top-down way of doing stuff. But what that fails to understand is the nuance within that country. We now have 100 countries that are classified as being middle income. And within that, you have communities that are as wealthy as the wealthiest in London. And at the same time, you have others who are as poor as some of the poor in sub-Saharan Africa, all within what we call a middle-income country. And what we haven't yet worked out is how do you do the pricing within a nation, if that's what's going on. But that's how demand is being shaped, and that's how nuanced things are getting these days. And it's important to realize this is a really big deal. Of the 100 countries that we're talking about, it's 5 billion of the 7.1 billion global population, 3/4 of the people who are classified as poor, and that's less than $2 a day. So this is a great example where the nuance in the environment out there is changing the kind of top-down approaches that we've had. This is the pricing equivalent of Sky Plus. This is what's going on. So sure, there's a lot of controversies around, obviously, you guys know this better than I do, about what's happening in the pharmaceutical industry to respond to this stuff. I actually like one of the responses that's come from the device industry. So Medtronic builds pacemakers. And it used to be, you go into the hospital, you get a pacemaker, you're gone. Medtronic sold the device, you've bought it, you put it in, Medtronic is sort of off to the bank, done. You bought our pacemaker. But if we remember this slide, if we can actually start plotting people over time, the danger to people who make things like pacemakers is that people are going to say, well, this is a pretty good pacemaker, but it was only good for about 1.5 years, whereas this one was all right and it was good for about 4 years. So the more we surface this stuff, the people who've built devices in the past are going to find an increasing amount of scrutiny on their business models. And so Medtronic, for me, is probably the most interesting device company out there at the moment because they went and bought Cardiocom. Now, Cardiocom is a sort of telehealth service, so you've got some kind of cardiac condition, and they, one way or another, keep track of you by the phone, maybe by kind of Skype-style services. And what Medtronic realized is that rather than let someone like My Clinical Outcomes come back to them and say, your product's rubbish, and it only lasts 3 years, whereas it needs to last 10 years, and therefore radically reduce its value in the market. They said, why don't we just go and own that space? And for me, that's a really interesting move from a device manufacturer to say, as people get more and more Sky Plus about how they do stuff, we're going to want to know what's going on. And I think for me, are some of the more mature responses that we're getting to this increasing consumerism or personalization in our how we have healthcare. So I'm just going to give you, that's kind of so often these things are very dispassionate. These are sort of dispassionate kind of analytics and stuff. I want to give you a sort of a sense of a reality that's out there right now. And this is one of my favorite stories. And it's sort of, we've talked about the shift to, the sort of personalized demand for care. Data's not that big a deal. It's really about insights, and the algorithm's going to be the future. And then there's tensions, so pharmaceutical pricing versus someone like Medtronic responding by wanting to actually own the space where they can have long-term sight on their patients. But in Toronto, they've got a really huge problem, and this problem is the same really in most countries, but I quite like the way in which Toronto have communicated to me, which is that in 1971 there were 6.6 working people putting money into a pot through taxation for the elderly, and then by 2012, what is it, 4.2, and by 2036, 2.3. Now this is a real problem for tax-funded systems, because while at the same time there is more demand off the back of Sky Plus, Uber, energy, how we curate our own use of energy, while there's more demand for personalized forms of healthcare, there's actually way less money to play with. And it's a massive crisis. And the way that has manifested for them, so by 2036, 2.3 working people. I mean, I don't know if you know these kinds of stats, but in Japan in 2010 was the first year, and it's the first country in the world where they sold more nappies for adults than they did for kids. I mean, this is a total crisis out there of funding. It's a real big deal. And yet this funding crisis is going on at exactly the same time as the personalization demand is picking up speed. And it is, quite frankly, it's a disaster waiting to happen, but for many people, it's already a disaster. And actually what this sort of tells me is that we need to get our data to work harder. We collect data and derive insights and make decisions from them. But if people are wanting more personalized forms of care, we have to get to that place quicker. And that's what they're worrying about in Toronto. So just to give you the stats on this, they spent $7.4 million over 4 years trying to reduce emergency admissions to hospital. Now, there's a big driver, and it's in England, it's in the US, and it's also in Canada. If you discharge someone from hospital and they return to an A&E unit within 30 days, you lose a certain amount of the money that you got for the initial treatment. And so it's become this massive financial driver for hospitals all around the world to make sure they discharge people when they're ready to go home, and they don't send them to homes where they're going to then fall over again, or what else is going to happen that's going to bring them back in. And this is a huge driver to what made them in Ontario ask themselves, how can they reduce emergency admissions? So 4-year project, $7.4 million. They had 9 initiatives, and they kind of approached it in this way. They sort of said, let's ask the smart people out there in what they want. This was really just the doctors. They said, doctors, what do you think we should do to stop people coming back? Then they chose the ones they wanted, and then they supported them through their endeavor to roll out their initiative, and then they were hoping to then scale them. $7.4 million, 4 years later, nothing. No change. No change at all. And this is at a time when the Ontario Ministry is literally deciding whether to close a school in order to pay for more healthcare. And over 4 years, they couldn't answer that question. And they asked themselves, what's going on? What is so wrong here? And what they realize is that, first of all, they can't wait 4 years to come up with an answer, because in another 4 years, that school is shut. And they've all got kids, and they want their kids to go to school. So the question is, what do you do? And this is another example where we have to actually change our approach quite radically. We actually, rather than do this, the standard way in which we do clinical interventions is we say, here's an idea, let's try it out, let's look at the data 4 years later and then decide whether something worked or not. It's not going to work when you've got this kind of financial picture looming. You just don't have enough slots of 4 years to get to 2036. We'll run out of money, care's going to get worse. And that's simply the reality of where we are right now. And so what they're trying to do is, you can see this is like edgy and new because they use kind of pastel colors and sort of a scribble instead of square lines and things. But what they're trying to do is radically change their approach to a clinical intervention. So they want ideas quicker. They want to select them quicker. And they want to be able to fail fast, as they say in the entrepreneurial world. And of course, that brings with it all sorts of issues. Failing fast could be a clinical safety issue. How do you fail fast in a safe way? How do you quickly choose things that you want to try out in a safe way? What if you're increasing mortality? How quickly can you find out if you're increasing mortality? There's something around our structures and processes around how we process data that is going to have to change radically for us to go from this very slow, plodding way through stuff to this edgy, iterative, quick way of coming to answers in order to deal with this kind of a crisis that's facing all of us right now. None of us have the answers, but this is really design thinking. Design thinking's been around for a while, and there's lots of kind of different definitions as to what design thinking is. But really it just comes down to try something, decide if you want to keep going, iterate it, try it again, decide if you want to keep going, iterate it, try again, keep going. And that's actually not how healthcare organizes itself in any way at all. And yet it really, really needs to. And so these are fundamental challenges that we're looking at, brought about by more personalized forms of demand and the crisis, the financial crisis that looms above all of us. So when I do this and I say one size does not fit all, everyone always starts thinking about personalized medicine, genetic medicine, blah, blah, blah. But as I talked about earlier on, that's probably not going to yield the kind of results that we're looking for, because the more we've looked at the genome, the less we've understood. We have to actually radically change the structures in which we operate if we're going to answer the financial chasm that's right ahead of us. Thank you.